there's a carrying capacity is one way of saying. There's these planetary boundaries. There's these ecological limits, and we surpass them and we're in trouble. And this is, I would argue, the fundamental idea of the ecological movement. If you draw too much water from the aquifer, you'll destroy the aquifer. There's countless examples of this principle that nature sets limits. And as the ecologist Paul Ehrlich said, nature bats last.
This week, I'm speaking with Charles Mann, an acclaimed science writer and the author of best-selling books 1491, 1493, and The Wizard and the Prophet. And as a self-proclaimed nerd, I was incredibly excited to have this conversation. Charles has done a ton of incredibly interesting work. So you're going to hear us talking about the history of colonialism, the Columbian Exchange, and exactly what happened when Christopher Columbus made that expedition to the New World, and the knock-on effects that shaped the world that we live in for centuries afterwards. You're also going to hear us talking about the many complex ways that geography and agriculture have shaped human development and movement over the years. So we pulled a lot of the ideas from his books talking about environmentalism and technology as almost new religions and the contrasting ideals of the wizards and the prophets. So I think it's a really interesting conversation. It probably digs into a lot of the ideas that you might already interact with on a day-to-day basis without realizing it, and it goes a lot deeper into these ideas that are helping to shape not just the world that we live in today, but also the world that we're trying to build for tomorrow. So I really love this conversation. I'm sure you will too. You can find the show notes, transcript, and read my newsletter at theknowledge.io. You can find Charles on Twitter at Charles C. Mann. I'll leave the links to his books in the description below if you're watching on YouTube, but if you're just listening, everything will be in the show notes. If you love this episode, please do share it with a friend. And don't forget to leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts, because it helps us tremendously to find other listeners just like you. So I thought perhaps the first question I would ask, you have three really interesting books, 1491, 1493, and The Wizard and the Prophet. And I was thinking about where we should start, but I thought maybe I'd ask you how you thought of the narrative arc of these three stories. I think they are different in their own way, but I think there is a common thread that ties them all together, starting from, you're looking at this period of the beginning of the 1500s right through to the Common Age and the things that we have to think about in the present day about how we progress towards the future.
Any question that begins by asking a writer what, their narrative arc is going to really produce a pompous, pretentious answer. Or unfortunately, I do have one. I'm sort of embarrassed because it's so pretentious. I sort of think of these three books as past, present, and future. And the 1491 describes what the Americas were like, and to a certain extent, what Europe and Africa and Asia were like before, Columbus and the encounter between these two hemispheres that had been separated for tens of millions of years. And that led to consequences that were as much ecological and biological as economic. And the wonderful historian Alfred Crosby called it the Columbian Exchange, where huge numbers of species from over there came over here, and huge numbers of species from over here came over there, dominated in its initial centuries by this enormous movement of Africans into the Americas. Just an absolutely huge and unprecedented movement, unprecedented just both in its size and the fact that none of 99.9999% of the people who came didn't want to do this. So this enormous involuntary and cruel immigration. So that, with all these swapping around diseases, led to this convulsion throughout the entire world. And that's the subject of, as I said, 1493. And one of the things that it's led to is an enormous increase in prosperity for those people who weren't its victims, if you follow. And this has led to this incredible situation where we have almost 10 billion people coming on the planet, this enormous level of global interconnectivity, and these, for the first time, really global environmental problems. And, how do we think about all this? This is this unprecedented era, built unprecedented cruelty and unprecedented prosperity. It's sort of hard to get around. And The Wizard and the Prophet is sort of my experience as a 20 or 30 years as a journalist. These are two alternative ways that it seems that most people have about thinking about how we should move forward. At least in my mind, there's a connection.
I'd love to start with maybe from the beginning with 1491. I think for a lot of people, their knowledge precisely of what happened when Columbus entered the New World, as it was called at the time, is quite limited to maybe topics around Thanksgiving and the questions of whether or not, people were nice to each other at the time. But I think what's so interesting about digging into your work is, first of all, I remember seeing an image of the spread of disease. And I think you showed it in a talk once where you show, okay, how diseases went both ways at the time. And on one side, you have a list of maybe something like 14 different diseases. And on the other side is only syphilis, and how that had some limited spread. And it's really this idea that it's almost unfathomable, the drastic impact that it's even before the settlers actually had a chance to do anything, the diseases that they brought with them already had a massive impact on the cultures on the other side.
Yeah, there's this epidemiological imbalance, and it goes very, very deep in history when, for reasons that researchers have been arguing over for decades, most of the large mammals in the Americas vanished, on the order of 12 to 16,000 years ago. We don't know why, or rather we have too many explanations. And what that meant was that most of the animals that could be domesticated, domesticable animals, all disappeared. So horses and camels and that kind of thing that had been over in the Americas weren't there anymore. And so the peoples of the Americas grew up without cows, horses, chickens, goats, and they also didn't have any analogies to it. So they didn't have beasts of burden or beasts of transportation. They just didn't exist. And that meant that was a constraint on the way that their societies, changed and grew and developed. And it was also meant, in some ways that was negative, but also meant something that was positive, because most of the great killers, disease killers in history are what they call zoonotic diseases, which are animal diseases that, as they say, jump the species barrier and become human diseases. We had a possible example of that with COVID, which, many researchers think came from bats. And the common examples are flu, which, came from chickens and poultry of sorts, and smallpox, which is, a huge killer, which either came from horses or camels, depending on which genus lead. And all of those have been causing enormous amounts of suffering and death for thousands and thousands and thousands of years in Europe and Asia and Africa, and didn't exist in the Americas. And so it wasn't exactly a disease-free paradise, but it was pretty nice. And one of the things that happened when the Europeans arrived is they brought these diseases with them, swimming in their bloodstream, as if all the suffering and death in Europe and Asia and Africa over the past however many thousands of years were compressed into a couple of hundred years in the Americas. And the demographic impact was just absolutely awful. Somewhere between 2/3 and 90% of all the people in the Americas died. And it's the worst demographic catastrophe that we know of in human history. And one of the really sort of remarkable things to me, as I've thought about COVID epidemic, is just that disease, which has a fraction of the mortality of something like smallpox or even measles, just convulsed our societies, and at least in the US, created these enormous political tensions. And yet native societies have suffered, worses that were just astronomically worse, are still here, which is incredible to think about. I'm not sure what would happen to the United States if we had 60% mortality. Well, you'd have lots of images of what that would be like in zombie movies and that sort of stuff. It would be bad.
Yeah, and it's one of those things that it's so easy to underappreciate. Like, imagine up to 90% of an entire population being wiped out. And this is before, when people talk about maybe there's genocide or other things where it is an intentional act, but simply just the diseases that came with the Europeans that settled has already wiped out a ton of people. And I think you also wrote about some of the ecological impacts that came with that. So, for example, Native Americans had a lot of practices about how they dealt with wildlife and being able to clear some of the land and using it for different things. And actually, when you had the rewilding, where a lot of this wildlife grew back and a lot of the forestry grew back, in some ways, from a modern perspective, that might sound like a good thing, but actually for them, it actually had a lot of negative consequences.
Right. Wilderness to a lot of Native people is a word that means a cemetery. It means a place that they've, in one way or another, been kicked out of. Sort of a lot of modern conservation dogma has a real bad taste to folks in that situation. It's pretty obvious why. And, there's a whole sort of moral argument about it, which you just briefly alluded to, which is if most of the deaths were actually caused by diseases, which, this is before the germ theory of disease. They weren't really under anybody's control. They didn't really understand them, and all that sort of stuff. Does this sort of let the settlers off the hook? And certainly you can hear that, we didn't do it. It was just the disease. But at the same time, it seems to me that if you find somebody in bad shape, who's been mugged and is lying there on the side of the road, and then you take the opportunity to rob them, like you don't really exactly have much chance to congratulate yourself by the fact that you didn't do the original thing, which was knock them out and leave them by the side of the road. So those kind of arguments seem a little silly to me. This was really, really tough on, a quarter to a fifth of humankind. And then it was followed by this enormous wave of slavery. So there's a dark part that, we should know about. That's the modern world is built on it.
Yeah. And I think there's a quote that you used or you've mentioned, which was something like, God saw fit to clear the natives for us. And I find it really interesting the ways in which religion and faith also interact with some of the human side of these interactions, where for a lot of people, for the settlers, they're thinking, this is God clearing the way for us and killing all these natives before we even have to start doing much. And then for the natives, they might be thinking they've done something wrong to anger the gods. And actually so the way that they are responding to these same things is also different. And I think about a lot of the ways in which that interaction or that duality has played out through some of the other circumstances throughout history as well.
Yeah. I mean, it's important to remember that people back then, Native Americans in the 16th century and Europeans in the 16th century, and for that matter, Africans in the 13th century, were more like each other than they are like, modern, more secular people. Even the most, devout person on the religious side, on the evangelical side, doesn't look at the sky and see a thunderstorm and say, that this is the interaction of spiritual forces. But that was the explanations that were available to people then. And so, one of the reasons that Christianity had such tremendous success coming into the Americas, and that there are so many devout Christians among Native people today, is that these cataclysmic events happened, and the only explanation available at the time was spiritual. We must have done something wrong, and it's a way of asserting control over it. And so it's pretty understandable that you would look for an alternative spiritual explanation when your gods have failed you. And so it's more complex than that. There's a whole bunch of ways that people adopt religions. For example, if you go to modern Mexico today, there's a Spanish festival that's widespread in places like Zacatecas called the Festival of Moors and Christians. And it's an adaptation of a Spanish festival that dates back to the 8th century or so. One of the odd things is that in places like Zacatecas, the Moors are all dressed like Spaniards, and the Christians are all dressed like indigenous people. So under the cloak of, this Christian festival, it's a festival of resistance, showing a bunch of, Zacatec native people killing a bunch of Spaniards and driving them out of their country. And so this kind of thing is very complex. And so anyway, I wanted to bring this up because when you say how natives have become Christian and so forth, there's all these, multiple overtones, and they're always because people are just crazy complicated.
Sure. Were there any narratives that you found particularly surprising as you were digging into this and doing some of the research?
Yeah. One of the things that I tried to get across is something that was said to me right when I was beginning. There's a Cherokee historian named Russell Thornton. And when I was beginning my research on this, 25 years ago or something, I asked him for advice. And he said, just remember that the people you're writing about are human. And, they're not specially good, especially bad. They're just people. And there's a real tendency in writing about these clashes in colonialism to paint one side as, as extra bad and one side as extra good, and to try to reduce these things to, in fact, these situations in which many people are thrust into conflict by things that are beyond their control. And so, in where I'm from, which is in North American West, many of the settlers who came in were fresh from Europe, and they're swindled as soon as they arrive, and told that there's this free land that they can have, which is obviously a desperate dream. And these people are desperate. They don't have any money. They don't have any ability to leave. They've sunk everything they have into it. And then they find out that their land is contested. And so there's this quality of desperation on both sides, fighting for what they see as an existential struggle, while people in New York are profiting from this. So there's this kind of complexities all the way through that I hope, in some way I'm able to convey to people who are reading the book.
Yeah, that's a really good point. It made me just think about in Morgan Housel's book. I mean, it's a completely different topic in some ways, but Morgan Housel has a book called The Psychology of Money. But one of the stories that he mentions in there is about how, like Hitler's rise to power. But if you look at newspaper clippings from, let's say, 1931, I think, you can see that even American newspapers are not necessarily taking Hitler's rise to power seriously, and they don't see the negative impacts that can come simply just a few years later. And I think it goes back to some of what you've written about, and I'm interested to know what you think are maybe some of the lessons that we could get from reading this, which is obviously a piece of history. But I think, like you say, the important thing is not necessarily just going straight to the abstraction of, okay, these are the good people, these are the bad people, this was the good thing, this is the bad thing. Because I think when you abstract things in that way, it's very easy to miss a lot of the lessons. Like there's a lot that we could have learned, both from how different groups of people interacted at the time and also how we think about the future as well.
Right. And some of it is that we all have in our minds an idea, of what is the good and what is, progress and what is science, these ideas. And they're pretty much what we see around us and what our societies are good at. And so one of the lessons for me of all the encounters is that peoples in the Americas have developed entirely different systems of agriculture that are in many ways more sophisticated than people in Europe and Asia. They're somewhat similar to systems of agriculture in West Africa, but the Europeans who encountered them just didn't understand them at all and didn't recognize native agriculture as agriculture at all, because they were used to what we call industrial monoculture, where you have large areas covered with a single crop, and then they're square and fenced off, and over here are domestic animals and these kind of things, where there's polyculture, where multiple crops are being grown in the same places, where you have animals integrated into this, and so there's no fences. And the Europeans came and looked at places like New England, where this kind of agriculture was being practiced. And they said, this is a wilderness. This is wildland. They simply couldn't recognize it. And one of the things that we should be, in some kind of ideal world would be that if somebody would have recognized this and would have understood that there are alternative ways of, getting crops from the land that are in many cases more suited to what we're doing. And so I live in the United States, and this is also increasingly true in Europe. The kind of forest management that we've done that, springs from sort of 19th century. Karl Marx is actually one of the early pioneers of European forestry. And if what indigenous style forestry had been understood, or it's possible that we wouldn't be having the forest burning all over the West now, and you guys wouldn't be facing the same problems. As you probably know, the level of fires in Europe is just going up. You guys are about 15 years behind California, but that's not very comforting, because you can imagine what's going to happen in 15 years.
Hey, we'll get back to the episode in just one moment, but I wanted to tell you very quickly about my newsletter. I started sharing everything I was learning online, and a few thousand people came along for the ride. I send 3 regular emails. Brainwave, fortnightly on a Tuesday, which is about the intersection between technology, philosophy, and psychology. Then every week on a Thursday, I send Revelations, and that's about creativity and productivity. And then finally, every other weekend, I send Wayfinder, and that's about decision making. So people in the audience actually send me really tough problems that they're working through, and I help to deconstruct them using mental models and decision making frameworks. So if you'd like to subscribe, you can join me and over 20,000 incredibly driven people at theknowledge.io. Okay, back to the episode. Yeah, exactly. It's a really interesting point that you raise as well. I know you're specifically talking about how that relates to the environment, but I'm just thinking about how the interplay of, okay, as Europeans came and discovered a lot of cultures that were already pre-existing, how they interpreted certain actions that they had, and how, I guess in the modern world, our conceptualizations of different cultural practices, we misunderstand why certain people acted in the ways that they did. And I think when you are able to take that slightly different lens, it changes completely how you would view certain things. So just like you were talking about, if you take a different lens on the native practices, on dealing with the environment, you might have a completely different view of how humans should interact with the ecosystem. But then similarly, the other example I was thinking of, so I wrote about this maybe a year or so ago in my newsletter, which was just this idea of African time, and this idea that when the colonialists came to Africa, sometimes you could see people sitting around or lying around and you think, oh, these people are lazy or something like that. But actually, when you start digging deep, and I did some research on maybe like some Swahili culture. So in Eastern Africa and some parts of Western Africa as well, you see, I think it's Swahili word. So you have a word called sisa and zamani. And so the way that they look at time, sisa is kind of like the short time. It's a mixture of the present and time that's within touching distance. And zamani encapsulates the near future, but also the far future. And so they just have these very different conceptualizations of the way that time works. And as a result, instead of having necessarily a calendar, you would just say, okay, this is the time that you do the crops. This is the time that you milk the cows. This is the time that you do this. And if it's not the time for doing that, then you do something different. And you're not running on this industrialist calendar where everything has to be done. Oh, has this happened by 11 p.m. or 11 a.m. and then you go on with your day like that. And it's really interesting. I think there's been a lot of work thinking about how the conceptualization of time, maybe in the West, has influenced so much about how we act today, right? And you think about turning up on time to have this discussion with me and the timing of everything else that happens throughout your day and throughout your life. And it's strange how, maybe if we had taken a different culture's concept of time, how different the future could have been as a result as well.
Yeah, we do have, and it's a natural part of being human. You grow up in a certain circumstances and you think, well, these are normal. These are the way that things should be. And there's a wonderful impulse in that. You treasure what you grew up on, but it's important not to let it blind you to other possibilities and other ways of doing things that you may end up liking or find better. A small version of that, also speaking of West Africa, I talk about it a little bit in The Wizard and the Prophet. There you have a system called silvopastoral agriculture, which is this fancy way of saying eaves that fall on the ground and the cattle eat them and the cattle fertilize it with it. And so you don't have, wheat or, these annual crops there. And you can have large expanses doing this with the cattle essentially taking care of tending the trees and dealing with the fire dangers and the trees sheltering the cattle and providing the fodder there. And you can take quite marginal land, very dry land that wouldn't really be suitable for agriculture with very little water, because cattle use less water than annual crops. You can, make it a highly productive system. And as climate change is happening, more and more of Europe and more of the United States and elsewhere are starting to look like these dry, arid areas in which silvopastoral systems are, millennia-old practices that have worked out beautifully in the Americas by when slaves came over and they would escape and they would escape often with indigenous groups like the Yaqui, or in northern Mexico. They would take these silvopastoral systems, and you see them in places like Sonora. And these are really, I think, things that should be explored and, for our agricultural systems to deal with the impacts of climate change and drought. But for an enormous amount of time, they were just seen as really crazy. Why would you have all these trees in the middle of your pasture? Well, why would you grow trees, as opposed to wheat, which you could just harvest? And so it didn't fit the mental categories. And, there wasn't great ill will in this and so forth, but nonetheless, it meant that almost no agricultural research, in places like Wageningen or Rockhamshire, where you are, or Davis, went into really understanding how we could use these systems. And so we're playing catch up because we had these perceptions about how things should be that weren't necessarily really the case, and certainly not for changing circumstances.
Yeah. One of the things that I loved in your work are the ways that you have described and really being able to tell this narrative of also the way that the environment has shaped so much of the world's development as well. And I'd love if maybe you could expand on that. I'm thinking particularly of, for example, the way that the potato shaped much of Europe's development, and also in China, how I guess the layout of the geography meant that they had to build these terraced architectures to be able to grow things and certain things like that.
So the environment is something that is a real constraint on us, but how we deal with it is really left up to us. It isn't so much that the environment causes things, it's just that people have to deal with it, and dealing with it shapes their cultures. And so, as you were mentioning in China, one of the sort of central facts about China is that it has hardly any water. There aren't any really big lakes in China, and it's only got these two major rivers, the Yellow River and the Yangtze River. And then, just to make things worse, the crop that everybody really likes there, rice, you have to grow it in swimming pools, it requires tremendous amounts of water. And so you have a culture with a society with 20% of the world's people, 8% of the world's above ground fresh water, and they're trying to grow this water intensive crop. In a certain way, that explains thousands of years of Chinese history. And what happened with the arrival of the Spaniards in the Americas is they discovered the sweet potato and the potato. And the sweet potato is probably from Ecuador, and the potato is from Peru. And they brought them over to Asia. And these are crops that can grow in dry areas in the way that rice can't or wheat can't. And the western half of China is all dry mountains and high plateaus. And it meant for the first time that these could be planted with crops in a serious way. And there's this sort of go west young man type exposure where the Han, who are based in the Northeast and are the sort of largest ethnic group in China and probably the world, sort of pushed out there following these American crops. And so the conflicts that we're now seeing in Western China and Xinjiang and so forth, they're in a sort of direct shin bone connected to a leg bone type way, related to this expansion fueled by the arrival of the sweet potato and then later the potato into China. And this had enormous impact, this potatoes, because the good part about potatoes is that from a point of view of feeding, if you have wheat, you know what wheat looks like, which I'm going to guess you do. There's a surprising number of people who don't. But it's a grass. It's this tall, skinny plant with grain on the top. And if you grow more than so much grain, it becomes top heavy and it falls over. This is called lodging, and it kills the plant. Whereas potato, all the good part is underground, so it can just grow as big as it wants. And in the 18th century, when all this was coming in, basically you get 4 times as many calories from an acre of potatoes that you could from an acre of wheat. Now, Europe had never been able to feed itself. It just doesn't have that much really good land. It's cold. And so there's just recurrent famine. In fact, there's this great French historian, Fernand Braudel, who sort of added them up. And 16th through the mid 19th century, there's something like a continent-wide famine every 10 years. Or I can't remember these exact, but it was just terrible. And there's hundreds and hundreds of local famines. There are granaries in the middle of cities, and they would be surrounded by armed guards. And if you read Daniel Defoe and those kind of guys, they're always talking about the mob, M-O-B-B, that's trying to get the food from the granaries and the soldiers killing them and so forth. So it's just horrible. The potato comes and suddenly Europe can feed itself. And this is a profound transformation. And it turns out that what happens to a lot of countries when they suddenly acquire the ability to feed themselves and to have a healthy population that's growing, they go out and look for other countries to conquer, at least in Europe. And this is really the fuel that's fed the European empires. Absent the potato in the north and maize or corn in the south, it's really hard to imagine how Europe would have gotten its act together to go and conquer all these other places in a substantive way. So you have these huge impacts. In China, the impact was also this empire, but then a second thing, they pushed into the northwest, which are these Loess, Loess hills, which is made of silt blown up the river valleys, up the Yellow River. Very fertile soil, but very dry, and it's sandy. And so to grow and stuff, they had to build these terraces. And the terraces were this huge amount of labor, and they didn't really work because they weren't faced with stone. They didn't have stone there. And they just all eroded into the things and caused these massive floods. So if you go on Wikipedia and look for, worst floods, the list of the worst floods, there's just an amazing number of them that occur in China in the 19th century. And tens of millions of people die of these sort of things. So it leads to, when you have these recurring enormous natural disasters, it's incredibly destabilizing. And part of what happened to China in the 19th century, these things like the Boxer Rebellion and the Taiping Rebellion, where millions of people died, are due to this ecological convulsion caused by the introduction of the potato, which was in sweet potato, which were in turn directly linked to the European colonization of the Americas. So you have this mix of politics and economics and the environment that I find fascinating. And I also think it's sort of a big part of what it is to be alive today.
Sure. And this leads perfectly to a lot of what you talk about in The Wizard and the Prophet. And you were starting to mention, I guess, the wheat, and you wrote about Norman Borlaug, who is the wizard in your book, who ends up in Mexico. You could probably do a better job of talking about his background than I could. But I remember that I think in Mexico, they were having problems growing corn, and he had a side project working on the wheat, and he found a way to make this super productive wheat by merging two. I think the hypothesis at the time was that you couldn't mix these two different types of wheat. And actually he found a way that you could. And so suddenly you have a hyper productive wheat, but then also I think he mixed in some Japanese long wheat or something like that. So maybe you could tell us something about that.
So just to make this book sound really appealing to your listeners, it's about two dead white guys nobody's ever heard of. But I think they're important. And one of them, as you mentioned, is a guy named Norman Borlaug, who's the only agricultural scientist, I believe, ever to win the Nobel Peace Prize. And I think he should be much more well known than he is. And what he is the primary figure in what's called the Green Revolution. And that's the mix of advanced crop varieties, high intensity fertilizer and irrigation that doubled, tripled, even quadrupled grain yields around the world, and are a big reason that all the people who predicted massive starvation in the 1960s, it didn't happen. That there weren't, and today the chance that an average person somewhere in the world is born into, in a place that suffers periodic food shortages is smaller than it's ever been, as far as back as we can measure. When I was born in 1955, I'm really old, 45% of the world was malnourished. And today it's something like 8%. And this is an extraordinary impact. And it's led to things like the rise of China, the explosive growth in places like Southeast Asia, the fact that India is now a burgeoning, all of this has to do with this increased agricultural productivity that people weren't just sort of desperately preoccupied with feeding themselves. And a lot of that was sparked by this guy, Norman Borlaug. And he began, as you said, in Mexico. This kind of a ludicrous thing. He had no experience. He'd never been out of the United States. He'd never worked with wheat. He'd never bred crops. And he nonetheless ended up getting the assignment to try and do something about this wheat disease called stem rust that was plaguing Mexico. And this, as you said, it was just an offshoot of a program to try and focus on improving corn, maize, which is what everybody in Mexico eats. And so he's just on this thing, very underfunded, but by sheer hard work, massive, insanely hard work over a number of years, created this much more productive varieties of wheat, which, if you gave them lots of fertilizer, it's essentially modern agriculture. You treat the land kind of as a petri dish, you put the right seeds into it, and you just flush it full of chemicals and water, and woof. And it's been enormously successful. This is the principal reason we have 7.8 billion people around the world. And this example, as you can imagine, has had enormous impact. And as I said, I'm a science journalist, and talking to scientists, often when you hear a problem, they say, well, I would like to do for X what Borlaug did for wheat, to make it cheap and productive and make more and produce our way out of whatever our problems. And at the same time, though, there was this other guy named William Vogt, who's even more obscure, and that's VOGT, a Dutch name, is the progenitor of the modern environmental movement, which is the only successful ideology, I think, that's come out of the 20th century. The fundamental idea that Vogt came up with and was the first to articulate was that we live in systems whose rules we can't violate. And if we expand beyond the bounds of the system and violate the rules, we're in terrible trouble. There's a carrying capacity, is one way of saying. There's these planetary boundaries. There's these ecological limits, and we surpass them and we're in trouble. And this is, I would argue, the fundamental idea of the ecological movement, but it's also the idea that we can't just treat the land as a petri dish and pour in chemicals. These systems are characterized by processes of their own, and we have to work with them, not just ignore them. And so that's where organic farming comes in. That's where all kinds of ideas about conserving water comes in, rather than trying to generate new water with industrial processes. There's a whole mindset of ways that and these two ideas of how to proceed are opposed in a certain way. You can think about what are the decision that's going to be in our children's generation is that, where are they going to go? Which path are they going to take in which places? And that's what that book is about.
Yeah, I love that example particularly with William Vogt, who I think you described as a bird watcher who went to Peru to try and figure out why the birds kept dying. And he realized it was because of, I'm imagining the map, but I think there's El Nino, which essentially meant that seasonally there weren't enough fish because there was a lot of small fish towards the shoreline that the birds ate. And because of these, I guess, the geographical events, the small fish would kind of get swept away from the shoreline. And so the birds couldn't eat them. And so suddenly all these birds are dying. And so it's this idea that ecosystems can be very brittle and they can only hold so much and they have the biocapacity. And then I think you go on to explore how, I guess, that idea pervades to this day.
Right. And the reason he was sent down there for the birds was that the birds, which are these cormorants especially, live on these islands off the coast of Peru. And they're enormous birds that produce enormous amounts of fertilizer. And in fact, that was the beginning of the global fertilizer industry, was mining these enormous piles of bird excrement on these islands off of Peru. And Peruvian government nationalized this and made a lot of it funds for, building roads and schools and so forth from the export of this excrement. And Vogt was brought there to see if they could, as he put it, augment the increment of excrement. And if he could make more birds, so they would have more poop, so they would have more fertilizer. And he discovered that there is these natural rules, these fluctuations, El Nino, as you mentioned, and La Nina, where the water temperature goes up and down. And that, if you increase the number of birds, it just meant that when conditions got less favorable during the next El Nino, more birds would die. There is a limit set by nature to how big these bird populations could be. You couldn't exceed it, and trying would just lead to tragic consequences. Said, wait a minute, this isn't just true for birds on little islands off the coast of Peru. This is a general principle. And in nature, if you grow too many crops, and exploit the land too hard, you'll destroy the soil. If you draw too much water from the aquifer, you'll destroy the aquifer. There's countless examples of this principle that nature sets limits. And as the ecologist Paul Ehrlich said, nature bats last. You can't. It will let you know that you've done bad things. And this is, again, the fundamental idea of the environmental movement. And Vogt wrote a book back in 1948 called The Road to Survival, which is like a blueprint for every environmental book that you've read since then.
Sure. So why do you pit these two guys against each other? Maybe you can break down the idea of the wizard and the prophet as being kind of polar ideals of how we deal with the world of tomorrow.
Well, what happened is essentially that, in the course of 30 plus years reporting on scientific and environmental issues, I realized that the people I was talking to tended to fit along, there's like a spectrum, and they tended to bunch up at one end or the other of the spectrum. Now, there's nothing like, this isn't like a natural law or anything, but it just was this very strong tendency that I had observed, that there's these spectrum of people lined up on either end. They were either wizards or prophets, and they were fighting each other. And so prophets tend to like small scale, democratic with a small d, networked resilient systems that go from the ground up. And so they like the idea of an inhabited landscape with patchworks of small farms and work solar installations, all of which under local control in which they can respond to local conditions. And that's a very powerful image in the back of the mind of, I think, many people, particularly on the left, but also, in different ways on the right. And then there's this other side that says, wait a minute, what we want is these enormous centralized facilities that are hyper efficient, that will feed these beautiful, dense cities that are walkable, where people can have the maximum amount of liberty and are, slaves to the land. And then we can have huge expanses of wilderness for animals that you can go visit if you want to. And, this is also another very powerful image. It's one that I think is quite common, probably where you are in London, or this gleaming futuristic city surrounded by this wonderful forest. But these things are incompatible. And so you end up with environmentalists fighting over nuclear power, or fighting over GMOs, or fighting over any number of issues. And what they're really fighting about is values. The different conceptions of what's important and different conceptions about how the world works. And my hope was that if I wrote a book about it, that people would go, oh, I see what's going on. Of course, this is incredibly naive, and these fights are continuing unabated.
Yeah. Even just you saying that makes me think of going back earlier in our conversation, how we were talking about the ways in which religion or culture can shape some of our values. I would love to know what you think is maybe the analog of that today, because I think that partly explains some of this split where there is no central locus that we can use to organize our values around. And some people, the new religion is perhaps technology. And for some people, it is, I guess, just following whatever seems the most ecological or biological.
I think all these are values that we all have. It's just that different people assign different weights to them. And it's pretty easy to find, especially in the United States, people for whom personal autonomy and the maximization of individual potential is hugely important. Let people flourish and do what they want, and not be tied down. And almost always that's associated with a real metropolitan view of how people flourish. It's in the city. You go to the city to be who you can be. You go to the city to cast off your old identity and create a new one for yourself. And this involves, necessarily the construction of really quite elaborate centralized technological structures to make it possible for you to live comfortably in the city. And so the sort of ideal vision of that is New York, say, with 3 gigantic nuclear power plants powering everything, and enormous desalination plants just off the shore, pumping in the water. And then surrounded by that is nature that you can go and visit. And that's really, appealing for many people, particularly because, city life can be really tremendously wonderful, and tremendous charm of it is that you can go to a place like London or a place like New York and, invent yourself. The other vision is, again, a very powerful one that goes back to people like Thoreau in the United States, and I believe Jethro Tull and people like that in England. And that is this image of the countryside as, you're rooted in nature, and you're rooted in your community, and you're rooted in a place, and you understand, you have this knowledge of what it's like to be there, and an understanding of how it's there, and your ancestors were there, and you're part of a community. And that's also extremely appealing. It's appealing to me. That's why I live in a small town, right? But I've also lived in New York City, and I at least have some idea of what it's like, to why that is appealing. And there's been this long divide between rural and urban, and this is part of it. And this is also, I think, part of philosophical division. So the people who sometimes call themselves eco-modernists, who have this vision of, this urbane maximization of individual potential, sort of think like, God, they want everybody to root around in the muck, and just be slaves to their farms and eat, and it's a recipe for poverty, and you'll hear that kind of thing. The other response is, well, you're just talking about kind of a deracinated enemy that's where everybody is just, these isolated atoms bouncing around each other, and how horrible that is. Because it's sort of awkward and uncomfortable to talk about values. They sort of say, well, your situation is not very practical because organic farms can't produce enough farm. And so that way I can tell you that it just won't work. We don't actually have to talk about values. And I can say, well, this is absurd. Your ideas of these giant cities, existing independent of their environment is completely crazy. And again, we don't have to talk about values. So they get through these proxy battles, which I try to talk a little bit about in the book too.
Thank you so much for tuning in. Please do stay tuned for more. Don't forget to rate, review, and subscribe. It really helps the podcast. And follow me on Twitter. Feel free to shoot me any thoughts. See you next time.